Hi everyone. Welcome to another edition of our Leadership Lessons Q&A event series. My name is Alex and I'm the Growth Marketing Manager at OfferZen. Before we dive into the session, I just have some rules of engagement to go through. If you do have any questions throughout, please make sure to drop them in the questions tab. We'll make sure to cover them at the end of the session to get you all your answers. We are recording the session, so you'll get the replay link post the event in case you missed out on any nuggets of wisdom. And the chat is open, so maybe while we wait for a few more people to join, you can say hi in the chat, maybe share where you're joining from. Just want to check that that's working. Give a few seconds. I see a few people typing, waiting with anticipation. We got some people joining from Victoria. Give a few more seconds here. Got some Klerksdorp, which is awesome. All parts of SA. Okay, I'll give it a few more seconds while people kind of drop there. There we go. They're all coming through now. And it's also great to see that the chat is working. So again, welcome to everyone that's just joined. My name is Alex, and I'm going to be hosting today's Q&A session. Just a few words about OfferZen. OfferZen is a developer talent marketplace that was founded in Cape Town, SA in 2016. With OfferZen, companies don't just hire, they hire smarter. You can choose to connect with top developers directly through our curated marketplace, or you can go premium with OfferZen Embedded, where a dedicated talent partner can join your team and handle a lot of the heavy lifting for you. If this sounds interesting, you can just select from the poll that's currently on your screen. Okay. We're going to be hosting a series of these events over the next few months featuring tech leaders from top companies, both locally and internationally. We'll be diving to real challenges, the career-defining moments, and leadership lessons that have shaped these leaders' careers. That being said, today we're joined by Lena Reinhard, an experienced engineering leader, speaker, and writer who's led globally distributed teams at organizations like Circle CI and Travis CI. Lena has built her career on leading with empathy, systems thinking, and a deep commitment to inclusive leadership. I'm excited to dive into her story, and let's invite her on stage. Give her a few seconds. There we go. Hi, Lena.
So good to see you, and I'm so happy to have all of you here today.
Amazing. I'm excited to dive into your story.
Same.
Maybe you can start with a quick introduction.
Perfect. So yeah, I'm actually in my 20-year career anniversary is in 3 weeks. So I've been at various roles for a very long time. I did start out in finance initially, and then been in tech for 15 years now. I've worked a lot in open source communities, had my own company for a while, and was a CEO there. And I've then been in engineering leadership roles for pretty much most of my time in tech, and now mostly focus on coaching for leaders and executives, as well as facilitation for teams and organizational development, and make a lot of art now. And yeah, I've really enjoyed thinking about the questions that you shared with me, and I'm excited to talk about them.
Amazing. Well, maybe just to remind the audience, we're going to dive into 3 main themes. So firstly, your journey to becoming a leader, the mess ups and the milestones that you maybe experienced along the way. And then lastly, building and leading for the future. And again, just a reminder to the audience, if you do have any questions, please make sure to pop them in the questions tab throughout. We'll tackle them at the end of the session. Okay, now that the admin's done, I'm keen to dive into the meaty bits.
Let's do it.
Theme number 1, the journey to leader. Let's start with that journey. You've written on your blog about career transitions and really identity shifts, especially in your becoming a manager post. You didn't start in tech traditionally, spoiler, and yet you've held VP roles at major engineering organizations. How did your path into leadership happen, especially coming from outside the typical engineering track?
I think a lot of it for me only made sense in hindsight, to be honest. For a long time, I've just pursued the things that I'm really interested in. And a lot of that has always been about bringing people together and helping teams have a space where they can do good work and work on great things together. I did Again, in hindsight, I already gravitated towards leading group activities in elementary school. I might have been a little bit bossy as part of that, and that's okay. But I've always gravitated to really like helping people bring out the best of themselves, and then ended up going into business school. Even though I did want to become a full-time artist, so that was a bit of a detour for me. But it ended up being really useful because it meant when I somewhat accidentally got into tech, I had got my first startup job because I was hired by that company to do the copy for their website. They wanted to do a website relaunch. It was supposed to be a 2-week project. And at the end of that, they offered me a full-time contract in their marketing team. And that's when having that business background was really useful, but also having that really deep interest in people and how they work, and that curiosity was really useful. Also, great type A personality. I love a good spreadsheet, which again, many people in tech hate, which meant even from the start, I brought a lot of things to the work that the people I worked with, like many of them, like deeply skilled engineers, just weren't as interested in as me. And so it kind of complemented each other very well and was a good starting point for me.
I love that. It really shows that you can shift into tech from any background. Like there's always a cool link.
Yeah.
Amazing. In the early leadership days, though, what surprised you the most about the shift into leading teams, specifically within more of a technical environment?
I will say it's something that like where the lore is kind of still quite like still goes quite deep, and it's that question of basically how like what shape do the problems have that we face in engineering organizations. And for me, the realization I think I had early on, but it took me a really long time to understand that there's actually something to it, which is that the majority of problems that engineering teams face are not technical problems. The technical problems, like yes, they exist, but they're about reconfiguring tools, or how do we use the things that we're working on, how do we work together. But the majority of them are really social issues in terms of like, yeah, how do we work together, how do we collaborate, how do we communicate, do we speak the same language, talk about the same things, um, do we have a shared goal, a shared mission, do we have the same motivations, or the things that like, drive us, are incentives aligned, and all of that. So all of those sort of soft and squishy things that even when I started in tech were still often quite looked down upon as sort of like, yeah, it's just humans. Like the real interesting stuff is the tech. And I do get the appeal of like programming and of like architecture and all that. And I do consider myself relatively technical, though that's also a very loaded term at this point. But really noticing that there's so much that needs work from the human relationships, interconnections, and whatnot side that then can enable that we build much better technology and much better products. That was a really big thing. And again, like I think I realized that early on, and it also meant that I think was able to be like modestly successful in my early leadership roles already, but being able to articulate it that way and also being taken seriously with that, I think took a long time. And I'm glad that the discourse around that has also shifted quite a bit.
Yeah, because I think technical stuff is easy to check mark, but the more social, softer skills, like it's harder to really like, how do you gauge how teams are developing, where they're shifting? Like it's harder to see the return on investment, investing your time there. But it plays off that long term when your team's performing, they're gelling well together, they're feeling that empowerment.
And
Yeah.
it's also the kind of work that's never fully done. And that also like it makes it exciting for me, but it also sometimes does make it exhausting and intense. Like there's less of a dopamine hit. There's not really like it's rare that you really ship anything in the sense that it's completed and you get to celebrate. Those instances do happen, but the majority of it is kind of a bit of a slog of sort of leadership hygiene stuff from like I run one-on-ones, I host team retrospectives where we talk about things and whatnot. And those things are just infinitely recurring meetings.
Yeah.
Or even if they're not infinitely recurring meetings, they're just still procedures that somehow happen asynchronously. And that's just, yeah, the nature of the beast, and like interesting, but also sometimes a bit tiring.
Oh, I can only imagine, but so important.
Mhm.
Maybe looking back, what would you tell your past self when you were just getting into tech?
I think the biggest piece is probably to adapt, but also not hide myself. I've spent the first years, especially maybe the first 5 or 6 years when I was really in tech, I've spent those years really trying to just blend in as much as possible, which was already a bit of a challenge because I was usually the only woman in a team. I was definitely also the only woman in leadership teams and later executive teams, especially on the engineering side. And I even try to blend in, and I have I'm about to release an episode about that on my own podcast. That wasn't even supposed to be a plug here, but about, because I've always really enjoyed just fashion and dressing in certain ways. And when I got into tech, I tried to really hide that. I started wearing the same hoodies and baggy jeans and conference shirts that all the folks around me wore, and like nothing against those, but I try to really blend in. And the way I dressed in those years is really, for me, so symptomatic of the other ways in which I try to blend in as well, in terms of like shifting my language or starting to use industry lingo and really picking up on the acronyms and the, like, yeah, just the terms that the engineers around me threw around. And I think that's okay. Like, that kind of adaptation is also something that we all do in those kinds of contexts. But I also, like, it took me a really long time to unlearn some of that and to get back to like, how can I show up as the person that I am and still sort of, yeah, adapt where needed and work with the people who are there, but without trying to completely lose myself to that degree.
It's actually a great segue into the concept of identity. And on your blog, you've written about grief in career change. Do you have any tips on how you navigated that identity shift as you moved into those more kind of senior but also abstract leadership roles?
I think honestly, the biggest piece I wish I'd done sooner was just to be aware that it's a thing, and be aware a bit more of what it entails, and sort of have some even just patterns to follow. And that's a big part of the work that I now do with a lot of people going through these transitions, because oftentimes, like, for example, just to name, moving from being a senior engineer to being a tech lead, or moving from being a manager to a manager of managers. And in many cases, those roles, at least at the surface, sound quite similar or even may look quite similar, but there's so much that has to change in terms of how you think, like thinking much more about the bigger picture, like how do things relate to broader business goals? How do we work with partners outside of the organization? Or even, what does good look like in the work that you do? A big piece of that for me was, like, I've always really prided myself in just being very productive and getting stuff done. And it's also, to my earlier point, it's nice to knock things out and like check something off the to-do list. But it took me embarrassingly long, to be honest, but realizing that especially the more senior I got, the less my job was really to just get done as much as possible, but instead to make sure we're doing the right things and we're doing the most important things. And on the flip side, that we're saying no to a lot of stuff in order to get those important things done, which also means a very different way of working, because it meant the to-do list really became infinite.
Yes.
And instead, it really becomes about, like, is this really the most important thing for us to spend time on? Or if the company, which like happens a lot because prioritization is hard, if the company has like 10 top priorities for the quarter, or like those things happen, then either like, are all of those things really equally important? And then how can we shape the work, like make it smaller, or run more experiments, or have more project-based teams setups? Can we make the work, shape the work in such a way that the scope is more manageable and a bit more experimental, so that our chances increase of like being successful? Or are there conversations I need to have with our stakeholders, with my boss and other people, to figure out, okay, which of those things are we saying no to? Because otherwise we're going to just let fate decide. Because like nothing, like never happens that everything really gets fully done to the extent you want it to. That's just the basic nature of the beast. And that was really tricky for me to navigate, because I had so much of my just honestly pride in my work also tied up and wrapped up in, I'm someone who gets stuff done and who people can rely on to get stuff done. And instead, again, having to focus much more on the negotiations around the right things. And I think the second piece of that was that I also really, like, I deeply care about the people I work with. I mean, you've alluded to that, and I think it's also going to come up a couple more times. And like, yeah, I prided myself a lot in being really, really empathetic. And at the same time, especially, I was working in scaling organizations. I've had to let go of some of that,
Mm.
because I do still think, and I think that piece is important, at least to me, I think it's still worth trying to make sure that people all across the organization at least feel heard, that you're considering their concerns, or their needs and motivations. But I think there's not even a number. I think it's just, even if your organization is 5 people, but it's really honestly pretty impossible to make everyone happy with everything that you're doing. And like making the trade-offs and figuring out like where are the areas where we need to like compromise a bit, where we maybe can't meet everyone's needs, and then also standing by those decisions, communicating them in a way that's like clear and empathetic but also firm, and then not feeling bad about it for a very long time because I can't make everyone happy, was something that took me quite a while to work through, because I had some deep-seated people-pleasing tendencies that I had to like address. And that, again, like it's just so much harder when your organization is a lot bigger than it used to be.
Yeah. But I think you hit the nail on the head there from people just want to be heard. They want to be heard and understood. And even if you can't action everyone's requests in some way, they just want to have that seat at the table and be acknowledged, which I love.
Mhm.
Good segue, another one, to maybe one of the most human things someone did for you early in your leadership career that you still remember today.
I had this really formative moment shortly after I'd left the first big team that I grew and scaled. That was when I was working with a bunch of folks as part of an NGO that was supporting the Ebola outbreak response in West African countries at the time. We were building contact tracing applications and apps for the call centers in the affected countries. And I was really burnt out after a really short time. So we scaled the team from like 4 to 60 people in 4 months. It was absolutely like incredible, and it was a phenomenal team I got to work with. But it was also, I think I'll probably link back to that a few more times because it was really such an experience that shaped me so much.
Mm.
And a big piece there was that, again, I knew I was burnt out. I was going to have to leave the project and the team. But my last big thing and mission was to hire my replacement. And like from my perspective, that went okay. We hired someone, the team appreciated them as well, and I left. And about, I think, maybe 9 to 12 months later, a former colleague on that team, like, we ran into each other because we were both based in Berlin, and um, he kind of took me aside at some point and said, "Hey, Lena, like, you were really great boss, but like your biggest mistake was that you didn't know what made you good." And that really hit because it was such a great compliment, but it was also kind of devastating for me, because I've always considered myself as like humble and someone who, is here to serve the team. And I realized that I had kind of overshot in that direction in terms of, yeah, not being really aware of the things that the team needed and the team, not just as it was, but also where it wanted to go. And instead, I'd mostly focused on the things that I thought were necessary. And I hadn't pulled in the team as much as I should have in hindsight. And the person who was my successor in the role just didn't do very well. And it had, I don't think, much to do with them, if anything at all. I don't know the details there, but it had the majority to do with it. They were just not what the team needed. And
Okay.
so I had so much that where I had thought I was doing my teams and the people a favor by taking on a lot of that hiring and kind of shielding them from it. And what I had done instead was projecting my own ideas and thoughts, where like, I ultimately ended up, again, I should have had many more perspectives on that and many more ideas from the team in terms of what they really wanted and needed, to work that out. And that kind of getting that kind of feedback was incredibly precious. Like, I'm still grateful to that former colleague today. And I'm so glad that he brought that up to me because it was something that I don't think I would have realized otherwise. And it was something that I really needed to hear because it really humbled me. And it made it very clear to me that, like, yes, the team really appreciated me. And I think, like, honestly, they were just great on their own. I just was mostly there to not mess things up further. But that also, that they, again, that I just couldn't do all of it on my own. And even my best intentions of shielding them and allowing them to really focus on the really important work that they were doing, those intentions really backfired.
Mm. Shows how important feedback is and
Yeah, that
involved
too.
that active feedback loop. I mean, I know you got it
Mhm.
a year later, but it shows how critical it is for a good
Mhm.
team dynamic.
Yeah.
You've said that leadership has felt like being constantly outside your comfort zone. You've already alluded it to a little bit in some of your stories. Can you maybe share a time that stretched you in a way that you weren't prepared for, and what you took from it?
Mhm. Um, so in a different setting, a couple of years later, I joined a company initially as an engineering manager, and it was like they had a quite intense interview process, and I, was quite interested. I'd heard really good things about the company, and I joined and started the role. And the mission that they had given me was to really take care of the team as it was, and maybe grow the team onward a bit more. And that all sounded great. And a couple of weeks in, one of the senior leaders in the company kind of pulled me aside and said, "Hey, here are some things that you should know about how things are going right now." And shared a few things with me in terms of like existing conflicts in the organization and kind of divides that I had been entirely oblivious to, and that also like no one had shared with me during the interview process. And it ended up being quite an intense time working with the team. And especially as I then kind of moved on to different roles within the company. And the big thing there in hindsight was like I was outside of my comfort zone to a degree that wasn't good for me. In hindsight, I should have drawn a line much earlier on. I wanted to stick it out and kind of continue on because I thought I could really do something. I could make some changes. I could also shield the team from some of those things that were going on. And again, it's kind of, I think we're going to talk a lot about my hubris today, but I think similar to the previous story, I had this idea that I could get that I could be a person that at least contributes to change. I wasn't thinking I could be the only or the person who single-handedly does that, but I overestimated how much I, as one person, was going to be able to do. And in retrospect, I should have just left early on and drawn the line there. I mean, I also had rent to pay and whatnot, so I also like I'm giving myself some grace there. But that was one big takeaway that like if you care about your team and want to protect your employees, that's a wonderful intention. But usually it doesn't work that way. Like no single person in any leadership role has that kind of power. And the main thing that you'll likely do is burn yourself out. Um, Especially with all those good intentions, because it makes it really, really hard to be that kind of buffer. I think the other piece that I realized there was that there is a difference sometimes between what companies say they need and what they actually need. Like I did a couple years later, long after I'd left that company, I looked at the job posting again for the job that I had applied for at the time that they initially hired me for. And there were a couple of things where in hindsight, I was like, oh yeah, there's a couple red flags in there. Or there are some things where I wish, now that I had more experience, that I wish I had picked up on a bit earlier. I couldn't. It's like I was young and silly. But where it's really important to vet companies. I did also end up overcompensating for that later on. So when I then interviewed for future jobs for a while, I maybe was a little bit too thorough and a bit too scared of kind of running into something like that again. Um, but yeah, I think there's a really fine line, especially if you care about the people you work with, between like, yes, like helping them do a good job, helping them focus, but at the same time, this idea of sort of I think it's been called a fire shield or just generally a shield, and keeping the team protected from things, it just doesn't work that way,
Yeah.
because things are going to get to them at some point, and you may just be delaying something that's just inevitable.
Yeah. I know you say it's easy in retrospect, but those things had to happen to shape you into the leader you are
Oh, that
today.
too. Yeah, I
Yeah.
just wish it had been a bit easier sometimes. But I guess that's how that works with gaining experience, right? Personal growth is not easy.
Yeah, it's not easy. But I mean, again, good segue into theme number 2 with the mess ups and the milestones. And, the difficult stuff, the setbacks, tough calls, and really the leadership muscles that are only built through that friction that you've just alluded to. I'm kind of keen to dive into the real talk here. What's a time something didn't go to plan? How did you handle it? And what did it teach you?
Mhm. I will say I spent a lot of time thinking about that question beforehand. And the main thing I wrote down is in all caps, all of them, because um, the main thing that I had to learn is that, like, yes, you can plan to a degree and it's important to be prepared. And like, there was an instance where we prepared a big launch and then last minute the customer changed their minds and we had to roll a lot of things back and ended up being a big turmoil. Or when another time when we wanted to introduce a new goal setting process for the organization and we had it all worked out beautifully, and then we like shared the news with everyone in the teams, and people just outright hated the whole thing. And there was again big turmoil, and everyone was against it, and we had to figure out how to kind of scramble and roll things back. And those kinds of things obviously didn't always happen to that kind of degree of escalation, but like I'm a planner. I did mention the spreadsheets and the type A personality earlier. And I'm like, one thing I lead workshops about handling change now and leading change. And one thing that I like to say at the beginning is that like I do consider myself stereotypically German in mostly two reasons. The one is I love structure, and the second is I really love potatoes. And the that it's both true, but it's meant for me realizing that, and it's hard to gauge that in general, but realizing that there is a certain point to which I can plan and to which I also think it's important to plan, where things like checking how will like based on what I know, how may people react to those changes? How may they feel about things? What can we put in place to address things beforehand? What safeguards can we have, or what feedback cycles, like things that make it easier? Or again, can we change the scope a bit to make it easier for people to adapt to the things that we want to do, or even just to bring them in creating it? Like, do they have ideas or opinions for how we should do things? Like that planning and preparation part is important, but especially in any organization that tries to like practice some sort of agile delivery, agile ways of working, and even if it's not a capital A agile, but sort of more
Yeah,
agile in the spirits of it, like you need to be able to adapt. And so I've shifted over time from a big focus on planning everything through meticulously and whatnot to instead seeing, are there like structures I can put in place to help us handle things and reactions and responses that people are going to have to it inevitably. Because even like I've considered myself a decent planner, but like even I can't expect or anticipate everything that's going to happen. And so that kind of shift to more focus on structure, that means in practice things like setting up a very clear feedback system. Like when we're rolling something out, like this, for example, like we're rolling out a new goal setting process, there's probably going to be a feedback questionnaire somewhere from the start where people can just submit things over the next couple of weeks and months. We'll have a plan that we will address any feedback, for example, in every company meeting over the next quarter, and we'll just talk about things that have come in, the responses we have. Maybe there's a dedicated Slack or team channel for people to ask questions. That's again very transparent. We may also already say when we announce the new thing that, hey, we're going to make this an experiment. We'll try this for the next quarter. We will listen to your feedback, and then we'll sit down together and look at what's been working, what hasn't, and improve from there. So all of those really like relatively small things. It is important to then also execute on them and not just like make the big announcement then like, oops, well, that didn't happen. It's not a good look. But focusing much more on the structures for agility and for adaptability has gone a really long way for me in being able to just shift the way that I work and just shift the way that I lead as a big part of that.
I love that. And I think it resonated with the audience. I don't know if it was
It's the
that or the
potatoes.
comments, but we'll take it. You often write about vulnerability and leading with empathy. Can you tell us about a moment where empathy changed the outcome of a difficult solution for you?
Mhm. Um, I think it was honestly the majority of the examples that I've just alluded to. Like we did have one specific one that I thought about a lot was we had a really big launch planned. We had a lot of cross-team dependencies in a pretty large engineering organization. It was just some like a company I worked with in the last couple of years, and um, a lot of stuff went sideways. Like one team had suddenly just unplanned, some people had to go on leave. There was another team where someone just quit and that person had a lot of critical knowledge, and like similar issues like that across multiple teams, and all of them were supposed to work together, and suddenly we were missing a bunch of people and everything like was falling apart, and people were outraged about it, and I think rightfully so, because like those kinds of high pressure situations, like a big launch or just a big change that you're planning, like those tend to really show the cracks that were already in your system and just kind of make them explode at the seams, in many cases. And so a lot of things that had already been quite tightly planned and were quite dicey, just didn't work out. And that was because we had just planned it in a way that wasn't very sustainable and not a very good setup. And so what we ended up doing is honestly like one piece that I've learned from Esther Derby. She's like someone who's been working in the agile-ish space and change leadership space for many, many years. I always recommend her books. And the big thing that she says is that people don't react to change, they respond. And because especially if you're a leader in any position, like you've already thought about a change you're trying to make, you've planned it out, you've talked to people about it, like for you it's old news. But if you haven't already looped in everyone in your company, and that's not always possible, then for some people at least it's going to be a surprise. And then people need their time to really process it and ask questions or like, think about how it's going to apply to their work. And I find like I'm not a naturally very patient person. This is really confession time here today. And so it's meant that for me, I would often find myself getting somewhat frustrated or impatient because then like things weren't moving as fast as I wanted them to. Because like, yeah, I'm in a leadership position. It's my job to like help us get stuff done. And like reframing things for me in that way made it much more empathetic. Like people don't react, they respond. And then it also doesn't make it a us versus them, but it makes it a collaborative thing where it's my job to understand, well, where are their concerns coming from? What do they want to change? What do they think would be a better approach for this? And that's something that, yeah, we applied with this launch example that I did as well. And it honestly made us a better leadership team because we realized that, again, we are limited in what we can do and what we know. And we've, yeah, I hope at least it was my impression that we did better after that. Of course, it's always, again, it's infinite work. But it was really important for me to realize, like, yeah, we are on the same page. We have different jobs, but we need to work together, need to figure this out together. There's no other way.
Yeah, we're all human at the end of the day.
Yeah, unfortunately, I know.
Unfortunately. What's a leadership value or habit you had to unlearn over time?
This is probably not ironically, but this is again where we land with empathy. I didn't unlearn my empathy, just to be clear, but I did in the beginning of my work in leadership roles. I hadn't done a lot of training. I hadn't learned a lot of frameworks and whatnot. I relied a lot on like my personality, the ways of working that I had learned, and the bosses that I had observed in leading, which also meant that it put a lot of pressure on me as a person because I don't think you can really fully separate out your sort of personal self and work self. I think some degree of sort of, yeah, separation between church and state is helpful to, like, so to speak, but I'm still me as a person in the end. And so what ended up happening was that I just took a lot of things on very personally, because I cared about the people, and I don't think I became a sociopath in the process. I hope not. But it did mean that I had to learn, for example, frameworks and tools, like something like the biceps model, I think is a really good example. It's a framework of human core needs. And I use that to have one-to-one conversations or even team conversations about what do we all need, what do we expect from one another, how do we best work together. So even small and quite simple frameworks like this, or things like team working agreements, or I know other people, like I haven't tried it much, but like using manager readmes as a way to communicate, here's how I work, here's what I expect. Those kinds of even small tools I found really helpful over time to make it a bit less about me as a person and my individual success or failure in terms of recognizing what people need or doing the right things, and instead systematizing things a little bit with things like this, or with even things like simple one-on-one structures that I would reuse, to have the important conversations, but at the same time, not just make it about me and my ability to be empathetic at any given moment.
But I love that even the way that you framed it, it's really about setting yourself up for success with all the different frameworks and tools. At OfferZen, we've got a thing called a toolkit, and you've got all these different, the hammers for this, and it's
Yeah.
all these examples, but it's essentially like you can pull on these different resources from your toolkit when you need it, because it is hard navigating certain conversations or tricky situations. So yeah, I love that.
Yeah, and it's a big part of the work that I do with other people now, and with newer leaders or even more experienced ones, where like, my goal now is to just figure out like what is a good tool to use in this instance. And that's very different from, are you failing or succeeding in this moment? But yeah, are you picking a tool that works, or did you pick one that doesn't? Well, then if this tool doesn't work, then pick the next one and try that out. And it makes it also much more playful, and again a bit less personal, which can make it much more manageable for a lot of people.
100%. Okay, last question for this theme. In your leadership is not about you post, you talk about holding space for others. When was a time you struggled with that, and what helped you grow?
I think it was really in my first leadership roles, and like some of the examples from that time that I've shared earlier really point in that direction. I struggled with that for a long time in pretty much all of my roles, and it was really the idea that I have my expertise and the people in my teams have their expertise, and in order for them to really bring their fullest expertise to shine and to really help us get where we need to go, I need to protect them as much as possible, and I need to take a lot of things off of them. The issue, like there are a lot of things obviously that are really problematic with that. One piece being that I just set myself up for burnout because like the buzz factor was enormous. That was also maybe in the time when I didn't know yet what the buzz factor is. But it also meant that, again, I just put a lot of pressure on myself. And most of all, the piece that honestly really irks me about this in hindsight is that I also projected a ton. Like I often, and it's something that I often see in other leaders and that I like to remind people of, because again, something I also did wrong is that um, we're all adults, we're all grown-ups, and like yes, we can and we should be respectful of one another and can also care for one another in terms of being considerate of each other's needs and like things that help us work or things that aren't working as well. Like all of that is really important, but at the same time, it's no one's job to protect other people in the sense of like where it becomes paternalistic. And where you're kind of infantilizing the people you work with, and out of the best intentions. And so I don't want to disregard that. It's not because people want to be that way. But even things like, well, I can't share those things with people because it might upset them. And in situations like this, yes, you need to think about how do you communicate those things and how do you then speak to people's concerns, even if you're only hypothesizing about them at this point. But the core of it is really like treat people as the adults that they are, and that also means bring them in with the good things as well as the bad things. And that took me quite a long time and was really, really important for me to learn.
Oh, it's amazing, and thank you for sharing so vulnerably with that. Let's move on to our final theme. I'm just looking at the time. I'm just loving. I just want to keep this conversation going. I'm keen to look forward. You often write about changing within the nature of tech, the role of systems, and also leading within complexity. You've already alluded to it a little bit around change management. So this real theme is about how you lead, keeping the future in mind. How do you approach creating clarity for your team within uncertain or ambiguous times?
That was also a really big lesson for me, where I've reframed it for myself at this point about less being about creating clarity and much more finding ways to hold uncertainty and ambiguity together. Where ultimately, yes, like the goal should still be that we create more clarity for each other and together. Like if you have a new project or a business problem to solve, like it's usually very ambiguous at first. And ultimately you need to come to something like, what are success criteria for this, or what goals do we really have and how do we get there? So I don't want to discount that part, but the problem is that usually getting there takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of working together. And I used to try and honestly basically approach things from a bit of a waterfall project management type of view, in terms of let's just get everything answered, get everything sorted out, and only then we'll be able to work. That is a valid approach in many contexts, but with the teams I worked with, like, we were trying to work in an agile fashion and move very, very fast. That just didn't work. And so for me, I'll just mention a couple tools that I like to use in that context. Like, one is from, it's called being like a dolphin, communicating like a dolphin. The idea is really like dolphins can't like hold their breath very long, and so they only stay submerged underwater for really short periods and then have to come up for air. So you just show up very frequently for your team. You talk about, here's where things are at with the change. Here's the next step. Here's what we know. Here's what we don't know. Weekly, or sometimes maybe even daily, depending on what you're talking about. There's also the rule of 7. I think it's a very old marketing thing. You probably know that better than I do. But the idea that you need to communicate anything important 7 times in 7 different channels. So you make your announcement in a company all hands, then managers talk about it in one-to-ones. You send an email follow-up and whatnot. So you have to just really lean into repetition. And then the third piece is really just having very clear feedback loops. I mentioned earlier an example of that already. Like, have channels, like ask people for feedback. If they struggle with giving you feedback, ask them for advice. Some people really like to give advice. It's the same thing, but it's the different framing helps. Or you ask people, how can I get 10% better at this? Or how can we do 10% better at this? So, try different framings to see what sticks with people and what helps them come up with ideas. So there's really, the majority of it is really staying connected with people, like, communicating regularly and naming it. Like, if you don't know everything, then don't pretend that you do. People are usually very smart. And so, say, okay, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, here's what I'm doing to figure this out. Like, that kind of being explicit about uncertainty goes a really long way, because again, we're all adults and we can handle it. And if we name those things, then it makes it much easier to deal with them.
I hope the audience was paying attention, because there were so many golden nuggets within that answer. Like, I absolutely love that. What would you say your current leadership North Star is?
I think the big thing that I think about a lot is that tech has always had a history of being somewhat dehumanizing as an environment, in terms of both like how we think about ourselves and the work that we do, but also in terms of how we think about or don't think about the people that are affected by it and the users of the things that we build. And with the major kind of boom that AI has had over the last couple of years, that kind of tendency is just increasing, and it's really increased drastically. And that also means that a lot of teams are under ginormous pressure currently. I work with many of them. I see it every day. And the question that I'm trying to figure out is of how can we like be human in these workplaces that we have in 2025? What are the things that we need from one another, and how can we set up teams in a way where they can do good work and also be okay as people in that kind of environment?
Awesome. You've worked across cultures and time zones. What has remote leadership in particular taught you about trust and communication?
I will say the worst thing by far is that there's so much, like, tacit knowledge has so much power. And tacit knowledge being the unknown knowns. So the things that, again, you're not aware that you're aware of. For example, like I've worked, so yeah, I'm based in Germany. I've worked a lot with distributed teams, but also especially with a lot of folks in Silicon Valley. And it's always been interesting because at the surface, there are so many things that like are quite similar in those cultures, or at least appear that way. But when you dig into it a little bit more, there are a lot of subtleties that can make communication implode very, very quickly. Like, from things like, how does one person use emoji? What do they mean when they add a smile emoji? Is it their kind of like way of expressing despair, or are they just trying to appease someone? How do people, like, what do people read into asynchronous communication? Like, the way that you read in your head Slack or Teams message can make a huge difference about, does this make your stress levels go through the roof, or do you just read it as something that's like just neutral and doesn't really do much for you? And so I've realized over time with working on that with many teams that there are often these subtleties that lead to a lot of frustrations and misunderstandings. And so that's where the really banal but also really important recommendation I always have now is like talk to people about how they communicate, like have conversations about how does feedback work for us, what do we expect from one another, because that kind of stuff erodes trust really, really quickly and much faster than you can build it up again. And also like meeting in person is important. I think rule of thumb, at least maybe twice a year, but it makes a huge difference because you need that kind of context.
Yeah, it's so important. I got a new manager a few months ago, and the first thing we did was like a relationship alliance document. And it's like being clear on this is how I show up, this is what I need, this is what they need from me, how, like, where do we need that support, where are those gaps? And it's so important because you continue to learn that about someone. So being upfront with it is so important.
I agree. It's a great example.
You said that teams are systems of relationships, and your leadership writing often draws from systems thinking. Can you share an insight or model that's really shaped how you lead your teams today?
I will say it's a real classic and it's just so good, is the iceberg model. There are different variations of it, but the idea really being there's things that we see at the surface, like, or at least the way that things appear to us. And then there are usually multiple layers of beneath that in terms of the motivations that go into someone's behavior, for example, or the values. And I found that, like, if you find yourself being frustrated with a situation or something is going wrong, it's really, it may feel a bit silly, but it's really worth following a model like that to explore like what is really happening, because it's a really good way to like manage your own emotions and like emotional reactions and stress factors and all that. And it's usually incredibly insightful in terms of just what you're able to come up with, in terms of what really drives people and why people act the way they do. Because one thing I find myself saying quite a lot recently is that like, we all have reasons for the way that we act. Like we don't do those things out of nowhere. But oftentimes those reasons that we have don't make any sense or are just completely silly to other people. And so taking that seriously and trying to really examine like what is like, yeah, what was someone thinking? Like also don't ask things that way. Like asking someone, what are you thinking? It's usually not a good recipe for understanding, but really trying to understand them. I like to describe it a bit as sort of bringing my investigative journalism hat, like taking myself out and just asking questions. Using a simple model like that is super useful. I did also, by the way, because I had a wonderful conversation with about systems thinking yesterday, I did just post a couple of book recommendations on my LinkedIn last night if someone's interested in that. There's a couple more also practical tools you can try.
Oh, awesome. I'll try and find the link and we can send it out.
I'll send it to you.
Yeah. To maybe end off the session, what do you think we need to prepare future tech leaders for that we aren't talking about enough?
People have emotions and emotions happen in the workplace. I'll leave it at that.
I mean, I'm happy to leave it at that as well. That's like okay, amazing. I'm keen to dive into some audience questions. I see we have a few already. Reminder to audience, if you have any questions, please drop them in the questions tab. Let's start with, do you have any advice for women who want to get into tech leadership roles?
It's a great question. With many complicated answers. I would say most of all, if you're interested in it, go for it. And don't let people detract you. And the second thing I would say is there's a lot of wisdom in books and many, many articles from people who've been there before us. I drew a lot in my early years from people who've been in the open source movement in the 1980s, like specifically women and members of other underrepresented groups. Like look up the history of those things and you'll learn a lot, because a lot of the core dynamics haven't changed much, and like you'll benefit from kind of our elders, your elders in the space.
Amazing. Okay, this is a little longer one. Have you ever joined an already established leadership team as the only new member and found it difficult to integrate due to the strong pre-existing relationships among the others? If so, how did you navigate the situation? If not, how would you approach navigating it?
I have, and I frequently work with people who do. Um, I would say one piece that is always useful is having a bit of a team reset in the
Mm.
sense of establishing new norms of working together. There can be something like some tools that are really good for that are the Strengths Finder by Gallup is one of those where you can basically take individual questionnaires and then talk about what are our respective strengths and weaknesses as members of this team, or things like restarting working agreements. How do we work together now? I've also found it a really good way to just do a big listening tour, talking to everyone I now work with and understanding what are their concerns, what do
Mm.
they need from me, what do I potentially need from them, and over time, honestly, like rather quickly, if that's possible, finding your voice. So not being afraid to share your opinions because you were hired to bring in experience and like showing that. The book, The First 90 Days, has some really good advice for that, and is a really good primer for kind of how
Mm.
to make your first 90 days in a new leadership role successful.
Oh, that's amazing.
Great
Okay,
question.
yeah, it was a great question. That's all the audience questions that we have for now. I'm going to run through our rapid fire end off, and I will double check if we have any other questions that come through.
Sounds great.
Let's start. What is one leadership myth you wish people would stop believing in?
Same as the last one, that there is no emotion in technology and that everything is objective that we do here.
Awesome. 3 books or resources that have shaped your leadership style.
The first one is what I already briefly mentioned earlier. It's Esther Derby's 7 Rules for Positive Productive Change. It's phenomenal. It has a lot of really great tools, and it's really shaped me philosophically and kind of driving change in my teams. The second is called More Everything Forever: AI Overlords, Space Empires, and Silicon Valley's Crusade to Control the Fate of Humanity.
Yeah.
Beautiful title, and it's a lot. It just came out, I think, 6 weeks ago or something. I love it. It's a phenomenal look at where we are as an industry now, but also like where we've come from and then where to go from here. It's by Adam Becker. And the third one that also shaped me quite a lot as a leader is by Sharon L. Bowman. It's called Training from the Back of the Room. It's primarily focused on designing workshops, but I've taken away from it so many ideas for approaching my work differently and shifting much more to viewing myself and treating myself as a facilitator rather than a leader who has to have all the answers. And she has a lot of really good ideas for rethinking the way that you lead.
Love that. And lastly, what's a quote or mantra you keep coming back to?
It's something by an illustrator. She's called Katie Ben, that I read a couple of years ago. And the quote is, "Don't forget you are a space baby, a giant to the ants, an ant to the giants."
Awesome. We do have one more question from the audience, which we do have time for, so I'm going to squeeze it in. Liam asks, hybrid versus remote, which do you prefer, and would you suggest a remote team move on site, especially in the startup phase?
I do generally believe that hybrid teams are useful and remote teams are useful. I think the majority of the answer is, unfortunately, it really depends. I think especially if you're a very, very early stage startup and you're trying to get to product market fit, for example, or you're even trying to get to a Series A stage and the first funding round, it can be really beneficial to have like more in-person time to really get to know each other and work together very, very closely. I think ultimately the question always needs to be, what kind of stage are we in as a team, as a company? What kind of dynamics do we need? Like, do we have a setup where being able to collaborate really intensely and have like be not just in the same time zone but same location, where that's going to be really useful for us? Or are we in a stage where we have the discipline, maybe a bit of the maturity that's needed in a like hybrid or even entirely remote environment? Like, I have been working in like predominantly remote teams for the last like 12-ish years already. And I do like that. I also still work remotely mostly, but there are some things that I still do with teams on site. Like, for example, I facilitate team offsites or leadership meetings that are about bigger things like strategy, where having the context and the additional benefit of just the dynamics that you get when you have everyone in person in the same room, where those dynamics are useful and where they're worth the trade-off of, for example, everyone having to travel in. So yeah, I hate answering things with "it depends," even though that's obviously usually the default answer for any leadership question. But I hope that gave a couple of pointers for what to think about.
That makes sense. Okay, well, that's us at the end of our Q&A. If I can say there's one takeaway, it's that leadership isn't just about making decisions. It's about showing up with intention, curiosity, and empathy. Audience, we will have the recording ready for you soon if you want to revisit the conversation for any nuggets that you might have missed. We also are hosting our next AMA, so I'm just going to publish it if you'd like to join us at our next one. We do these about monthly. And then just a huge thank you again, Lena, for your stories, wisdom, and vulnerability and honesty with us, for sharing it with us today. We're so grateful to have you part of the conversation. And then,
Thank you.
thanks so much to the audience. Enjoy the rest of your days.
You too. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.